All right, recording in progress. So thanks, everybody, for joining us this evening. I'm David Preston. It seems like most of you already know who I am, but I'm a longtime member of Sons and Daughters of Holocaust Survivors of Greater Philadelphia. Welcome to our May 2024 book program. This is our fifth monthly book program of the year, and the 13th in a series that began last year. Our group was founded in 1979, which makes us one of the first organizations of its kind and still going strong. We have no dues or officers, but we do have a passion for truth and a bond formed by shared experience. We're an active, vibrant, and welcoming organization. If you are a child of survivors, and if you live in the Philadelphia area and you're interested in joining, please drop us a note or leave a note in the chat, and one of us will respond. These free monthly Zoom programs are always at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Sundays, and they're recorded, and they can be found within a day or two on my YouTube channel shown in the chat area. And this program will be available there tomorrow. One person I see on this call is not a child of survivors, and I'm going to embarrass her here, but I know she has a deep interest in the issues that we discuss, and she has become a loyal participant in these monthly book programs, and she lives in the Republic of Malta in the Mediterranean, where it's now 1 o'clock in the morning, but she is not deterred by considerations of time or distance. And she always asks good questions, and she knows that I appreciate her participation. In fact, I consider her the personification of the motto of the Republic of Malta, Virtute et Constantia, which is Latin for strength and persistence. I really don't want to embarrass you, Rosa, but if I'm not mistaken, your birthday is coming up in just a few days.
Yes.
So a happy and healthy birthday in Malta from Sons and Daughters of Holocaust Survivors of Greater Philadelphia.
Bravo.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be here. I grew up reading the testimonies of survivors, and it has influenced me a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you. I also hope that everyone will make a note of next month's program, which is right around the corner, coming up 2 weeks from today at 7 p.m., Sunday, June the 2nd. I'll be hosting a discussion of Peter Wiesner's fascinating and unusual memoir published last year, Bipolar Refugee, a saga of survival and resilience. Peter's mother, who died in 1991, the daughter of a pious cantor in Germany, was 16 years old in 1939 when she was sent on a kinder transport from Berlin to England, a journey that saved her life. Peter was born in England in 1945, spent his childhood in Berlin, where his mother returned after the war, and emigrated to California in 1954. Since 1980, he has lived outside Philadelphia in Newtown, Bucks County, and he recently joined our organization. His book is based on his mother's 60-page typed manuscript about her life. That's 2 weeks from today at 7 p.m., Sunday, June the 2nd. Peter Wiesner, who is with us, raise your hand, Peter. He's on this call with us tonight. Bipolar Refugee, a saga of Survival and Resilience, published in 2023 by Amsterdam Publishers. The Zoom link will be the same as the one you're using right now, and I hope you'll join us. Many of our programs have featured celebrated authors of critically acclaimed books. I guess you could say tonight's program is a special edition. We who grew up with families fractured by the Holocaust were given replacement relatives to compensate for our real relatives who were missing from our lives. In my case, as a child of two survivors, I grew up without grandparents and uncles on both sides, all of whom had been murdered. Fortunately for my sister and me, after my parents got married and arrived in Wilmington in 1951, my mother met someone like herself, a Jewish woman from a town in Galicia, now Western Ukraine, who also had survived in hiding while the beautiful flowering Jewish world of their childhood was destroyed. Fortunately for my sister and me, we had our mother's best friend, our Aunt Dorothy. And we also had her husband, Louis Finger, our Uncle Lou, the son of Delaware's first Jewish judge. Uncle Lou, a U.S. Air Force bombardier shot down over Yugoslavia, a prominent attorney, the first head of the American Civil Liberties Union in Delaware, a lover of Louis Armstrong, and a jazz and classical pianist in his own right.
Oh my.
Until the fateful night in 1982, when my mother died suddenly, when Aunt Dorothy was right there with us in the hospital in Philadelphia. I don't think more than a day or two went by during those 3 decades when those two women were not on the phone together. But we all knew this moment was coming. We, children of survivors, knew that our parents, our guideposts, would not always be there when we needed them most. We knew that one day we would look around for guidance through rough waters, and they would not be there. We knew that one day they would be gone, and it would fall on our shoulders the challenge of assuring that their survival was not for naught, that the lessons of their hardships would not be forgotten. This country has seen white robes and burning crosses. We've seen swastikas and skinheads and tiki torches. And now we're seeing keffiyehs in the Ivy League and on other college campuses, some even worn by American Jewish kids whose grandparents, like Louis Finger, fought the Nazis. We have our work cut out for us. Last Wednesday, at a meeting of the Helena Wynne Preston Holocaust Education Committee of the Jewish Federation of Delaware, a committee started by my mother and my Aunt Dorothy, I proudly set in motion a goal for the committee to fund the reprinting and distribution throughout Delaware schools of the self-published and now out-of-print 2015 memoir we will be discussing tonight, as well as to assure the continued distribution of the 2022 memoir by our beloved member Ann Jaffe, who died last month, because it's too important. The stakes are too high not to perpetuate the work of these women. As painful as their memories were, we owe it to them and to humanity for the truth to continue to be told through their words. Tonight, I'm proud to host my Aunt Dorothy's daughter, Sue, who is an administrator of a synagogue-based preschool in Virginia, and her son, David, a prominent lawyer in Delaware, and Diane Isaacs, a retired professor and Holocaust educator who helped to edit Dorothy's memoir, Es Brent, Yiddish for It Is Burning. My copy of this out-of-print memoir is inscribed to my dear David and Rondi, with all my love, Aunt Dorothy. I would like for Sue to start us off, perhaps by reading an excerpt, if you would.
Sure. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. And thank you, David, for inviting us. The book was originally meant to be for the family, and of course this has expanded out. But when my mom wrote it, it was for, basically for the family, and it includes her story. It includes a lot of other things in it, pictures, a lot of letters that she received. And I am so grateful for my mother for putting this together, that I have this now, and that all of us have this now. She wrote her story 3 years after being liberated. She was in the forest when she was liberated by the Russians, and 3 years later found herself living with a cousin in Germany for a year. And she sat down and wrote it all in Polish. And this is transcribed from that. So she was 17 when she wrote her story. And I wanted to read the very first paragraph from her journal. Pardon me while I find it. I should have had my reading glasses on, but I think I can manage it. It says, "Oh, how I long to share thoughts with my loved ones who meant so much to me and now are but dust and ashes. Unfortunately, life is difficult and one must stoically march on. Memories of my dear ones can be preserved by me, leading a life the way they wished for me, to be an ethical person, to remember my Jewish heritage, and to tell the world what the German Nazis did to us. Today, when I am living in freedom and see that the world is beautiful and free for all people, and I have lost all those I loved, I am very unhappy. But a person is stronger than iron and must suffer. And so I also must have strength and courage." And I felt that that was a very profound thing for her to write, that last sentence about being stronger than iron and needing to suffer, but also needing to persevere and have strength and courage, really kind of sums up a lot of who she became. And I think that's true for lots of the survivors.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Sue. David, I want to give you a chance to say a few words, if you'd like.
Yeah, I just want to give a little background to this project. It was long in gestation. When my mother met David Preston's mother and they became thick as thieves, David's mother was an educator and was already telling her story. My mother was not emotionally or prepared to do that, but she would come along and be supportive of Helena's talk. And it is only when Helena passed away that my mother started speaking out. She felt that Helena, and I guess, prepared her, and you could not allow there to be silence anymore. So she spoke, and she spoke at schools, and she spoke at churches. She spoke wherever she wanted, wherever someone would invite her. At that point, though, a book was not in the offing, although she had long wishes to do this. Now, after Schindler's List came out, my mother, her interest in the Holocaust was, exploded. And I remember she was asked by the Shoah Foundation to record her story. And my mother really didn't have any fondness for any modern electronic devices. So it was hard for her in the first instance to use the tape recorder, but she got a hold of it, but it became harder still for her to actually say her story out loud. I would remember coming home from school and hear her sobbing in the bedroom, and because she had to take a break because it was so hard for her. But she was committed to doing this, and she spoke more frequently. But then, as my sister said, her 80th birthday was coming up, and she decided it was time. She was only, I guess, a couple of years earlier when she started this, but she knew her 80th birthday was coming up. And the student said it was supposed to be a gift for the family. And she worked with a number of wonderful, kind people who assisted her and helped with background history and illustrations and things like that. And on her 80th birthday party, despite her best wishes, it was not ready yet. It was very close to being ready, but it was not. So it's shortly thereafter, my mother started handing out hardcover copies. But then someone suggested to her that it would do society well for her story to get out further as best it could. So we learned of a self-publishing unit who worked with Amazon on a one book at a time basis. And people could, and to some degree did, purchase the books on Amazon. And the publisher would publish, I said, one book at a time and then ship them. After a while, I guess the interest waned, and so the publisher shut it down. But we have a story. Her story is ongoing. And like Susan, I'm incredibly proud of my mother.
Well, thank you, David. So the cover of the book is taken from the ceiling, the restored ceiling of the synagogue in Chodorov, which was Dorothy's hometown. And the title of the book, as Brent, is the title of a very well-known poem written by Mordecai Gebirtig, who actually wrote it in the 30s, and it became a bit of an anthem for Holocaust survivors. It refers to the town burning, and Gebirtig himself was murdered in the ghetto of Krakow in 1942. But I'll read you the translation of one of the many translations of this Yiddish poem, and this one appears on the inside front of Dorothy's book. It burns, brothers, it burns. Our poor shtetl pitifully burns. Angry wind with rage and curses, tears and shatters and disperses. Wild flames leap, they twist and turn. Everything now burns. And you stand there looking on, hands folded, palms upturned, and you stand there looking on. Our shtetl burns. It burns, brothers, it burns. Help can only come if you return love, which shtetl once inspired. Take up arms, put out the fire, douse it with your blood. Be true, show what you can do. I encourage folks to go online, look up S. Brent. you won't find this book, but you'll find references to this extraordinary poem and to the life of Gebirtig. And you'll see some very interesting presentations by not just people singing this, but also there's a really unusual presentation by a Polish group called the Mordechai Gebirtig Project, where they're essentially juggling with fire. And it's really a very powerful contemporary piece of work based on this powerful piece of writing. All right, let's move on here to our friend Diane Isaacs, who Dorothy credited in the book with. Well, I'll just read it to you in the first acknowledgement. My love and thanks to my dear mentor and friend, Dr. Diane Isaacs, who worked with me tirelessly, reading hundreds of letters from students, teachers, and others. She edited this book, and without her, my dream would not have come true. Thank you for your love, support, and encouragement. So with that, I give you Diane Isaacs.
Well, it's an honor to talk about Dorothy. Can you hear me all right? Okay. I met Dorothy at a Holocaust Education Committee meeting. It was my first one, and I introduced myself as somebody who had worked in Holocaust education for 30 years and was very involved and believed that schools should be teaching about the Holocaust. And I was appalled to learn that in Delaware, there was no requirement for teaching the Holocaust. I moved here in 2002. I had lived in New York and New Jersey, and there was no question that they were teaching the Holocaust. So when I got here and I got on the committee, I said something like that. And after the meeting, Dorothy said to me, you know, I'm having trouble finding someone to work with me on a memoir. I want to do my memoir. And I said, you found a person. I am honored. And she invited me over, always lunchtime. We met weekly, had wonderful lunches together. And she invited me over and she said, well, maybe there's some letters you would like to look at. Well, I thought, okay, you know, a box or two. I never saw so many letters in my life, box after box after box of thank yous and appreciation for what she had done. And we looked at those and really made a commitment that that story was going to be, her story was going to be written down and used in schools, because that's really the importance of that story, that students learn from it and learn as a young woman how she survived. It's amazing. It's amazing.
Right. So thank you. So the centerpiece of this book, shall we say, or where the book starts out, is an English translation of Dorothy's Polish language memoir that she wrote in 1947. The original manuscript was written in 1947 when she was still a teenager. And she was 13 and 14 during the times of her fleeing through the woods and hiding in different places. So it's a short memoir, but it's jam-packed with information that that seems immediate because she wrote it right after the war. So then I think so it was written in Germany in 1947. And her name, by the way, was not Dorothy Finger, but Dysia Kraushar. And the book then moves on after that to share some of the work that important work that Dorothy did. She because I feel that because Dorothy was a girl, really, shall we say, at the time that she lived through this, including witnessing the murder of her own mother. She really devoted herself to speaking to young children in schools, audiences of young children, and so I really feel that it will be an important way to perpetuate her work, to have this book reprinted and distributed in the schools. She also, it must be added, was the impetus behind constructing, well, not constructing, but funding the placement of a very, I think, striking monument, of a very striking monument in front of the Jewish Community Center in Wilmington, along with the Garden of the Righteous Gentiles. It's a monument to the 1.5 million Jewish children who were murdered in the Holocaust by the very fine Israeli sculptor Aharon Bezalel. And Dorothy dedicated that, and all of that is contained in this book as well. So I mean, I think that it's critically important to recognize Dorothy's strong commitment to educating children and remembering the children. This book, the memoir, contains the very difficult recollection of the death of her best friend, who was just a child. So it's just my hope that that Dorothy's memoir and the accompanying materials will get a wider dissemination. The rest of the book, as Diane mentioned, has a large number of reprinted letters from many people, but most significantly from young people. And I think that really makes the book even more compelling, and I would say useful as a teaching tool in elementary schools. Yeah, Sue.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, I do need to correct something though. My mother was not present when her mother was murdered. But regardless, it doesn't make it any less tragic, of course. I wanted to mention that my mother, when she spoke to the schools, she would ask the teacher to please have the kids write letters to her. It's why she had so many. It's because that was her request. And I think she mainly wanted to see what her impact was. But I also think what was really wonderful about asking that is it forced those kids listening to her story to actually reflect on what they heard and sort of anchor it by writing her a letter. So I really do think that even though I don't know that she was thinking of it as a teaching tool in itself, I think it's really great that she did ask for those letters to be written.
Okay. So the very last paragraph of Dorothy's memoir says, my mother and Aunt Fania hid in the attic for several days, but then the man told them they had to leave. At night, they ran into the fields and covered themselves with the wheat. They spent several days without food. The rains were terrible. They decided to look for something to eat, and one of the farmers noticed the wheat was moving and notified the Gestapo. The SS men surrounded them and shot my mother and my aunt. Bala fortunately managed to escape. So you could see why I was confused.
That's okay. Yeah, that's just a technicality.
Okay. David, we're back to you. Can't hear you. Okay. At this point, would anyone like to ask questions of David or Susan or Diane?
Okay, I'm back.
Oh, okay.
And this thing muted against my will. Is there anything you wanted me to touch on in particular?
No, I want to give others an opportunity to ask questions. Well, you know what? Let's ask Carol and Irene if they remember their father delivering kosher chickens and eggs to Dorothy's house. You have to unmute.
Absolutely. That's what made me sign on, because I remember the Mrs. Finger, like he had to pick out the, Preston Finger were the names I always remembered. I was probably at your house when I was a little girl. Who knows?
Do you know if it was for my parents or my grandparents? Because I have no recollection of my parents getting chicken or anything like that delivered. The only thing that I recall being delivered was they had a traveling fruit man who would come to the house. But it is not my recollection that there was ever chicken. I wonder if it might have been going to my grandparents.
Well,
Maybe it was.
You probably
This-
weren't paying attention.
This was like in the 50s and 60s. 50s and 60s. So do the math. I don't know if it was, but Thursdays it was. I remember the
Absolutely.
Tuesday.
Brandywine Hills, right?
Okay, if that's your North Star for this, then you're right.
And there was also a Mrs. Butterwich.
Buttovich.
Buttovich,
Yes.
yeah. Yep.
Well, I remember her
Three
too.
names
The name, yeah.
Butterwich sounds better, but it was actually Buttovich.
Butterwich.
And in
We
fact, her daughter.
remember Mr. Stern. David and I were always very excited when Mr. Stern was coming with the kosher chicken.
Butovich's daughter Rona serves on the Holocaust Education Committee now. Her parents weren't survivors, but they were very, very prominent members of the Jewish community. I think Shirley, you have a question, right?
Yeah, I do. Hi. Around what age were you made aware that your mother was a survivor, and like how much of a presence was that in your household when you were growing up?
I'll start. It was my mother was very careful about what she disclosed and when. I don't remember a particular start period. It was sort of like little drips and drabs, almost by osmosis. And I don't have much memory before age 8, so I can't really say, but it started to get more, I know it became more acute. I knew about it. If you remember I guess it was in the 70s, there was the Holocaust miniseries with Meryl Streep. And I must have known that because I urged her not to watch it. I didn't want her to go through that suffering. Little did I realize she felt she needed to do that. But I guess that was the point, I guess in early high school, where it was clear to me, and even then, she protected us, I think, from the worst of it. There are things I didn't know until I saw the book. But I just knew, like I said, it's a horrible thing to know that your mother has a pain that you can do nothing about. And so I just, I tried to keep her from it, hide it from her. That was totally wrong and ineffective, but that's all I knew to do, or to try to do. Sue?
Sue, you have to unmute, please.
David, you're muted.
Hi, sorry. I think that's very common for children of survivors to want to protect your parents. I think I would agree with David that we learned it bits and pieces. I remember as a small child, I knew my mother had lived in the woods for a year. I didn't know much about it. I don't even know if I thought to ask about it when I was a young, 7 or 8 years old. So yeah, we did learn it in bits and pieces, like David said. And when I was in 11th grade, we went to Wilmington Friends, and you wrote a research paper. And I actually chose to write a first person narrative of my mother's story. So I actually interviewed her at that point and got a lot more details. But like David, there were things I don't think I knew until I read the book. And I think because of the way I never heard the story just told chronologically, there was, you heard bits and pieces, so I got more of a narrative, a chronological narrative, probably by reading the book. There's a couple things I wanted to say. I hope it's okay about the thinking about the book. Of course, I reread the book recently just so I could be ready for this book talk. And one of the things that really struck me reading this was thinking about obviously what my mother went through, and every Holocaust survivor went through, was an incredible trauma. But I want to read another small paragraph that my mother wrote in her journal. It says, "It's very difficult for me to write this, for no one in the whole world can understand how I feel. There is no one now, and no one ever will be. My life now is very sad, and writing now, a few years later, and reliving those moments of horror and sadness have left me completely broken." And it made me think about what an additional trauma. It's like a trauma on top of a trauma. So she had the trauma of going through that, trying to survive, losing her family, and what a trauma, just that huge trauma. And then on top of that is the trauma of loneliness after it happened, that she had that loneliness of no one being able to understand how she felt. And I'm sure this is true of all survivors. And it's just overwhelming to me how sad that is. And I know that finding community, and for my mom, finding Helena Preston, of course, helped mitigate some of that, because here was someone who did know, but still each story was different and each person is different. And I just feel like just how, I don't know, it just was just realizing that there's, that kind of trauma was compounded by that kind of loneliness that probably never went away.
That's very good, very deep. So my mother was several years older than Dorothy. In fact, the book shows Dorothy's Wilmington High School yearbook photo from 1949, a time when my mother was already at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York and beginning to speak publicly around the country about her experiences. So I think that is another. Well, I should also add, 3 years after completing high school, Dorothy graduated from Wilmington General Hospital as a nurse. Now, one of you should tell the long rumored but discredited story about how your mother met your father.
David, go ahead. Is David, are you on? Okay.
This thing mutes me against my will.
Yeah, yeah.
Because my mother was a nurse and because my father was a bombardier, shot down over the Pulaski oil fields during that raid and rescued by the Hungarian resistance. The romantic minds created this idea that both of them met in Hungary when with the resistance. She was nursing his injuries. Of course, she would have been much too young to do that if there was a 10-year age gap between my father and my mother. And he left law school to go to sign up for the war. So I suspect she might have been actually in it still, in the Holocaust still. I'm not sure of that, but it was not true. But they had fun with it. That's all I have to.
Okay.
I do have another.
Please, yeah.
Just another thing in thinking about this book and what I wanted to share. The other thing I thought struck me as pretty profound is the importance of things and the importance of particular items and things. So for my mother, it was a bolt of cloth that she received after the war when she went back to her neighborhood. And this is in the book. And I see, David, you're looking for the picture. When she went back to her neighborhood, she went to neighbors that her family had given items to store for them. And she came back and her neighbors said, "Oh, we thought you died. We burned those things." And it was devastating for my mom because it was mainly the picture albums is all she really wanted. And they were gone. And she had a teacher who had saved a bolt of cloth that had come from her parents owned a department store. And she had saved that bolt of cloth and she gave it to my mother. And as you see in this picture, my mother, when she was in Wilmington, had a suit made from that bolt of cloth. And for my mother, that was it was like the bridge between her and her parents. She said it was the only thing that she owned that her parents had touched. So you can see that cloth and that suit that hung in her closet, she never really liked the way it fit on her, but it was still so important for her. And for me, I wear a ring. I have it on now. It's a beautiful star sapphire ring that my mother wore all the time. She always had it on her finger, and I always loved it. And now that she's gone, whenever I wear her ring when I go out. I feel like I'm taking my mother with me, like she's with me now. It's just this ring. It means so much. I go out to lunch and I have it on. It's like I'm taking my mother with me to lunch. I don't wear it all the time, but when I put it on, to me, sometimes just the importance of things, just certain items. And I think a lot of people will also understand this and relate to this. In the Holocaust Museum in DC, there's the room with the shoes. And that is that room that strikes a lot of people. I mean, the reality of it, just seeing all those shoes that were taken from people when they were taken to the concentration camps or into the ovens. And I think that more than watching all those historical clips or seeing pictures and such, the shoes many people find so moving. And it's just like like we all wear shoes. We all put our shoes on in the morning, and seeing those shoes, I think, hits people, like the reality of it. So I just sort of wanted to just mention like what it was for my mother, that bolt of cloth, and I think we all can relate. So in telling a story, how these items can mean so much for anybody who's going to be maybe writing a memoir, or it's just sometimes how these items can be so relatable and can stir up so much feeling.
I think that's absolutely right. Our friend in Malta has a question. But you have to, there you go.
Yes. Considering what we're going through now and what your mother went through, I mean, David Preston, I mean, when I saw your post about the Zoom, it spoke about how the synagogue was burnt. And this weekend, there was an attempt in France, I don't know if you've heard about it, in Rouen, where they tried to burn a synagogue. Thankfully, they stopped him in time. The police stopped him in time. Is there anything in your mother's book or in other reflections that you shared that you think would be useful for us to help us cope with what is going on?
I don't know that it would be useful in that, but I do think it's important for people to know these stories because it humanizes the events, obviously, and that's true of all the memoirs, not just my mother's, of course. I do think it's more important than ever because as we're seeing now how little history so many of these people are learning or that are and there's a lot more now denial of the Holocaust or the numbers. A lot of the kids don't believe it or don't, they minimize the numbers. And that's why the stories, because I mean, the numbers are hard to relate to, but the stories everybody can relate to. And, you know, my mother says in her memoir, and I couldn't find, I looked for that particular section. She said, if she hadn't lived through it, she doesn't even know if she would believe it. Because you can't believe that a person can go through so much. It's just you know, and that, and you can't believe all the brutality and the barbarism. And yes, it's just amazing. I know that people say you have to learn history so it doesn't repeat, but I have now come to agree with the other saying that people say it's not. We do know that history repeats itself, but what we need to learn about history is the signs that it's coming, so that we can prepare for it.
Yes, exactly. That's why I asked, because it's like seeing bits of history repeat itself, and not everybody seems to realize it or to care. Thank you.
Thank you. Sherry, did you want to say something?
Hi, David Lee Preston's sister, and was my Aunt Dorothy also with Sue and David. What I wanted to say was Shirley, who asked a question. Where are you on my screen? I'm looking for you now. There she is. Shirley Cohen, me, and Susan were all in Camp Ramah together when we were little, and that's pretty cool. And Shirley said she didn't know that my family had that background. And what I wanted to answer was different from David and Susan, maybe in terms of when did you realize? Like, we were raised with it, so it's like there's never been a moment in my life since babyhood that I didn't know about the Holocaust. Like, I was born knowing about it. I don't remember a time not knowing what my parents went through. But then again, I have David, the journalist, writing everything. But still, even as a little girl, that's just my response to Shirley's question. And nice to see you, Shirley. I don't know if Susan remembers you as well.
Yeah, I do. Hi, Shirley.
Well, I think that uh, the only difference that I can see is that Dorothy married an American, and I've seen in my travels that survivors who married non-survivors um, uh, were had an opportunity to gain some coping mechanisms that, but by on the other hand, by contrast, I think that survivors who married other survivors had had some shared unspoken uh, um, ways of coping. So I think it probably cut both ways. I would ask Simone Gorko to perhaps add some thoughts in this regard. Simone is a very accomplished therapist and has worked with children of survivors for many years.
I think that you're right. There were differences in families based on whether there was an American parent or another survivor parent. But I don't know that two survivors always shared their experiences with each other, because they could be so different. Every story is different. Every story that I've heard a survivor tell is a different story based on so many things. The age, the family background, the what happened during the war, what happened after the war. But my parents always talked about it. Like Shari said, I always knew about it. And it came up just at the dinner table around food. They would say, if I didn't eat, it wasn't, oh, the children are starving in China, which my generation was told. But it was, oh, what we would have given to have that during the war. Or pumpkin. My mother would tell the story that in the ghetto for a month, all they had was pumpkin. And that she never wanted pumpkin again. So she would make a big Thanksgiving, but we'd never have pumpkin pie because it was pumpkin. So it came up in ways that weren't necessarily overwhelming. I think my parents told the heroic parts of their stories and not the horrible parts of their stories. And I'm grateful to them that they did that. But I don't know. There are other people on the call. Gail Brenner is here, and her father was the survivor and her mother wasn't. Maybe she would like to comment on that issue of, did that give her father some additional coping mechanisms, having a non-survivor wife?
Well, it's a good question, but I don't know that I have the answer. My brother would have the answer, who is not on this call, because I didn't really grow up with other families of survivors to compare. And my father didn't really talk about it, again, in bits and pieces and vignettes and stories. I knew from a young age because of the numbers on his arm, but I don't think I knew, he didn't talk so much about it until he was much older. Yes, there probably was, more of a balance with my mother being American born, yet she lost family in the Holocaust too. Her parents were from Russia. she lost family. So, honestly, I don't know. I can't answer that, to tell you the truth. I mean, it's just had such a huge impact on me personally. So I don't know. I'm sorry. I can't answer that. Yeah.
That's okay. That was an answer. It's a good
Yeah.
answer. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I think that as a child of two survivors, I could say that 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 there was a shared unspoken empathy that an American spouse, an American-born spouse, could not be expected to have. On the other hand, I think I would submit that that Louis Finger represented uh, a way for Dorothy not to have to think about the past if she didn't want to, because he represented all that was new and exciting and bright and the future, and not the past.
And his family was worked very hard to make her feel like this was her family.
Well, that's right, and I of course I remember your grandparents, um, Aaron Finger and Mrs. Finger. They were somehow larger than life figures in the Jewish community in Delaware, and can you or David or both of you talk a little bit about them, if you would, and how because Dorothy addresses this in her book, how they, particularly I think Mrs. Finger, helped her so much after she arrived in Wilmington.
David, you want to take that? Okay, is David muted again?
David keeps muting me.
Okay.
I think when my mother has on more than one occasion said that my grandparents didn't treat her like a daughter-in-law, they treated her like a daughter. And they loved her and she loved them. I can't put any specifics on how they cope, but I do want to bring up something that's a fact that is kind of maybe unique to our situation. My father's sister died very suddenly and very young of a brain aneurysm. It may have been 1960 or 59, but that was a really dramatic and horrible incident for my grandparents, my parents, and it cast a great pall over our future. And so what I don't know is how this recent tragedy, and I'm not comparing it to the Holocaust by any stretch, but I'm saying this is something that a new trauma that everyone had to deal with, kind of reflected in some small part about the Holocaust, which was still terrible to my mother, but she was also dealing with this fresh trauma. And she loved my father's sister tremendously. So that I can't answer the psychological effects of that, but it was certainly a factor in her evolution as a person that may have had some minimal or temporary effect, means to distract her from trauma of the Holocaust.
Well, your father's sister's son is my lifelong friend, Bernie Gordon, who's on this call, and I would like to invite him to say a few words. You have to unmute, though.
Thank you. Thank you, David. I would I would just like to share one memory of Aunt Dorothy. In her later years, many times she would come to our home here in Virginia, Northern Virginia, to attend the annual Passover Seder. And she, near the end of the Seder, we would always sing Hatikva, but Dorothy always requested that we sing America also. And she was very grateful for everything that this country was able to provide for her, and that and even with her passing at the Seder, we continue to sing the song every year.
That's really a lovely reminiscence, Bernie. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
David, I'd like to do one follow-up kind of related to that. And now it just slipped my mind, so I apologize.
You know what, you think of it, well, I wanted to share an anecdote when you were talking about my grandparents and the relationship my mother had with them. It's an amusing anecdote. My grandmother actually made, I don't know if it was for Shabbat, but I know some nights she actually made 3 dinners, one for my grandmother and my grandfather, one she would send to our house for my family, and one to Bernie's house, to the Gordons, for their family. And my mom would serve the food to company, and she said to her mother-in-law one time, to my grandmother, she said, you know, can you teach me how to make these dishes? Because when company comes in and I'm serving them the food you made, and they want to know, like, if I made it, it's embarrassing for me, you know, to say, no, my mother-in-law made it. So my grandmother, who was, she was serving, you know, making all these meals, because at that time we were all young children, and she knew how busy our families were. And my grandmother said, all you have to do is, if somebody says, this is delicious, did you make it? And you say, oh, do you like it? And they say yes. And then you say, thank you. So that's how she got that's how my grandmother told her to get out of having to admit that she didn't make it.
That's a pretty good recollection there, right there. I'll tell you. I don't think David can top that one. And he's not even muted.
Oh yeah, no, there's stories about her.
No, I'm going to expand on that. My grandmother didn't just cook for the family; she cooked for the neighborhood.
Yes.
And she was, and she fed a lot of people, and that's because that was her commitment to the community, largely Jewish community. I have many anecdotes about my mother in various ratings, but I don't think much of that relates to the subject matter of tonight's discussion.
I do have something I want to add, though, that I think is really important. As my mother spoke, the lessons that she taught about the Holocaust were always lessons that I thought everybody learned. As I got older, I learned that some people's lessons about the Holocaust was, you take care of your own, and you don't care about other people. You need to take care of your own. And sadly, to me, that was a lesson I found out that some people took away. My mother's lesson was always about treating everybody fairly, treating everybody equally, treating everybody with kindness and dignity. And that's how I try to lead my life to avoid another Holocaust. So I'm really, really grateful that my mother, despite everything she went through, could be hopeful and could be positive. And I think that's pretty amazing. And that's amazing for all the survivors who had that and who wanted that to be their message.
Yeah, what Susan just said reminded me of what I was going to say before. My mother, in my experience, there are basically two kinds of survivors. Maybe this is just a broad generalization. There's the kind of survivor who carries it with them on alive, and their faces are just masks of sadness. And I had two aunts up in New York, and one of them was just that she was constantly unhappy. And then there was the other people who refused to let Nazis defeat them in that manner. And my mother was like that. My mother, like she said in her book, she said, she looked back and saw a dead world, but she looked forward and saw her future. And everyone loved my mother because my mother loved everyone. Not everyone, but most people. And she had a big heart, was open to it. And as I think David told originally about the Aunt Dorothy stories, there were quite a few examples of that. Not to take anything away from David, but she embraced life. And
yes, she did. Yes, she did. I think Shirley has another question.
Yeah, actually, I hate to ask it because the discussion is so positive now, and this will kind of bring us back down. But when we were kids at Camp Ramah on Tisha B'Av, they would really focus a lot on the Holocaust. And when I was a 10-year-old, I had no idea that I'd lost so much family, because I don't think they really talked about it yet when I was that age. But I remember going to Camp Ramah, and on Tisha B'Av, they showed us the film Night and Fog, which they would never do anything like that with kids these days. But here I was a 10-year-old, I knew nothing about the Holocaust, and I still to this day have an image in my head of one of the stills from that film, and I probably shouldn't say what it is because I don't want to upset anybody here, but I can still clearly see that little image. Shari and Sue, and I don't know which others of you went to Ramah. Do you remember that? And if so, did you relate that to your own family life, or was that like just something removed and it was Jewish history? And like, how did that feel for you?
Well, I thanks for your question, Shirley. I actually do remember being shown actual newsreels from the liberation of camps, not overnight camps like Camp Ramah, but liberation of death camps. We were shown the old original newsreels. So I mean, I'm I don't know, 5 or 6 years older than you are. So this apparently was something that was considered an acceptable thing as a teaching tool back then. As an adult, I don't have a problem with it, but I will say I never forgot it. And I kind of thought, okay, this is my legacy. This is part of my legacy, and I need to know about it. Of course, not everybody in Camp Ramah was a child of survivors, so I can see, and you're not, right, Shirley?
So my great grandparents and my great uncles and aunts and their kids were all killed. My grandmother left Kalush in 1921, and then her sister came out in 1939. I said this in the chat, she came out on the last boat. I forget which port it was, but she begged my grandmother to bring her over, and she was on the last boat, and the rest of the family stayed. And my grandmother stayed in touch with them, and she would get these cryptic messages like, oh, we don't need the Passover dishes this year. Basically telling my grandmother we're under restrictions and we can't, do Jewish things. And then like there was one time when they asked my grandmother for a dowry for someone, and my grandmother realized like, well, that person's already married. They must need money to bribe the Nazis or whatever. And then at some point she stopped getting the letters. And then she wrote, and then she just started writing letters saying to anyone in Kalush, do you know where my family is? And finally, after the war, she received a letter back from someone in Kalush. And that person said that her entire family had been murdered, except for the sister who was in the States. And the Poles, it wasn't just the Nazis, there were the Polish people involved as well, that they came into that village and rounded up the Jews and shot them. And one of my great uncles went into a barn and hid in a pile of manure, and he was discovered and shot. So I don't know if that makes me, I'm not really the child of a survivor, but I do have the family connection.
Well, that's absolutely true. You do.
I have a comment to make with regards to not being a child of a survivor. I never considered myself that because my mother got out in 39, and my relatives, many of them got out in 38 and 39, and they went to Shanghai and South America, and many of them wound up in Los Angeles, where we were finally reunited. But I think what is my own experience sort of contrasts a lot with what I'm hearing today. I get the sense of a close-knit Jewish community in Wilmington and Philadelphia, where there's sort of ongoing support. I never really experienced that, even though we were plugged into the Jewish community, because of it was pretty secular, and even my relatives were very secular. I mean, they got together for Passover and so on, and but it was such a departure from what my mother grew up with. Her parents came from a very devout. She came from a very devout family, but I wasn't really raised that way. Although I went, I went to temple some of the time, but I think the general ethos was just not to talk about what had happened. And my mother didn't consider herself a survivor. She just talked about the guilt of leaving her family behind. And that was also the story of many of my second cousins and cousins who, I knew that there were people who were left behind, but none of them considered themselves survivors. So there was a tendency just to say, we just got to continue on. That was a horrible situation. We just continue. But I sort of grew up in an environment where the Holocaust was never directly talked about. It was referred to indirectly. There were comments about how life was in Berlin before, but never really about what had happened to all the aunts and uncles that were murdered. And I didn't find out until my mother had a bipolar episode. And so my sister and I kind of had a baptism of fire into the Holocaust. But even then afterwards, I didn't really want to delve into it. I knew about it, and we didn't really discuss it. The relatives didn't discuss it. And I talked to my second cousins about that. And, they relate stories about seeing their father cry because he wouldn't get out of Germany in time to survive. And so there was a lot of shame attached by those, feelings of shame by those who managed to get out, and also perhaps assigning some kind of feeling of shame to those who refused to leave or couldn't leave, which was the case with my grandparents. And so I sort of grew up in that kind of environment, and I got, and I really didn't even want to go to a concentration camp to visit, even though I became increasingly aware of the Holocaust and read an awful lot of history about it. But I didn't really want to confront it emotionally until after my mother died. And I think, now living on the East Coast, it's really a different environment here than it was out in Los Angeles. I think there is, more structured community here. And I mean, that just seems to me my impression of Jewish life in New York and Boston, Philadelphia, and so on. So I'm kind of trying to learn about, listening to other people's stories to get a sense of, I'm still in the process of assimilating this whole legacy, and I wrote a book about it because I kind of my mother wanted her story to tell, and I said, well, anything you want, Mom. I had an Orthodox bar mitzvah because she wanted me to have one, even though I wasn't really inclined to do that. so I have all these feelings that impel me to talk about it, and it's tough.
Well, you're going to be talking about it in
Yeah, I mean,
2 weeks. Judy Fogel wrote in the chat, "You are a child of refugees." Well, he knows that.
I mentioned for the other speaker, but yeah, for the other commenter.
Oh, okay. All right.
He meant
Okay.
it for Shirley.
Shirley, yes. But for both of you, yes, you're right. Mm-hmm.
Sherry Preston, do you have a comment?
I was just gonna say that I can't remember when I first saw actual footage of the show. I really can't remember when that was. As an educator, on lists of Jewish educators, that Susan's probably on similar lists of Jewish educators, where they talk about at what age to teach what, and to teach paper clips, and to teach. There was a whole discussion on JED Lab Jobs the other day about the boy in the striped pajamas, and one guy was reacting strongly not to show that because it was not logical that a little Jewish kid in Auschwitz would have a Christian friend right outside the gate that he'd be holding hands with or something. So there, I don't know. I know in Hebrew schools we've always started Holocaust education in 6th grade. All I can say is that for me, the weirdest thing that ever happened was being in a regular movie theater in America. And I don't know if it was Schindler's List. I apologize. It was the ending of some Holocaust movie where they shot the little girl. Did they shoot the little girl in the red coat at the end of Schindler's List?
Schindler's List.
Yeah. So the entire audience like freaks out and goes, "Oh, they actually did that!" And I was like, "Am I all alone in the world not knowing what Nazis actually did?" To me, that was a shock that the entire audience was shocked that the Nazis would shoot a kid.
Okay.
David?
Yeah.
I want to back up a little bit. When Dorothy was in, obviously, you saw the picture of her in high school and her nursing school, and she was a sought-after commodity. She had 2 guys chasing her, Lou Finger, lawyer, and Martin Yalosov, dentist. And she would go out with one, then go out with the other, until she finally made up her mind that the Finger was the better choice. And just to top it, Martin Yalosov I became his dental partner, and I took care of David's father, and so.
And my father.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah.
George was one of our favorite people.
So she actually preferred my dad, but if he didn't ask her out, if Martin Yalosov asked her out, she'd kind of put him off. And then if my dad didn't ask her out, then she'd go out with Martin Yalosov.
Well, that's wonderful. David, thank you for that. Okay, so unless anyone else has another comment, we've had a really wonderful opportunity to, I think, honor Dorothy tonight. I feel really good about it. I'm sorry that not everybody who wanted to join us was able to, but it's recorded and they'll be able to watch it later. I want to thank everybody for joining. I wasn't able to personally thank everybody who's on this call who I see on my screen, but rest assured that I'm very grateful that you're with us tonight. And I am looking forward to proceeding with the plan to make sure that Dorothy's book gets republished and gets redistributed, and so that the schools in the state of Delaware, at the very least, if not in a broader area, will have the opportunity to read the truth about what happened to someone who lived in Delaware who cared and pursued the teaching of young people so that we might never see this again. Any last minute requests or comments? If
How do
not,
we get a copy of the book?
well, sorry, I think you came on a little bit late. We are hoping that that this out of print book is going to be reprinted
So we can't get it now.
before long.
Dave,
Okay.
let me start off a bidding war. I looked on Amazon, and there is apparently one copy of a used copy available, and I think it's at an exorbitant price of $27. So if you want to wait, take your chances and wait for the Holocaust Education Committee to get it.
Jeffrey Strauss, you can afford that.
You can find copies now and then on eBay or Abe's. You know, if you Google it, there are copies. There's actually one on Amazon for $100. I don't know who's that's not nobody's going to get that for the book, but occasionally copies do come on.
Well, that's right. I want to thank. Go ahead, David. I'm sorry.
I don't know if you're aware, but we had assigned the royalties rights for the book to the Holocaust Education Committee after my mom died.
Okay, Rosa, did you want to say something?
Yes, is there a more recent picture of her? Sorry, it's just
yes.
curiosity on my part. Because
I will send. You know what? I'll post some. Well, Sue and David can do so as well. Right, that's right. That's on the back page of the book. The last image of her. I'll show it too. Yeah.
And
Thank you.
there are recent ones too.
It's good to put a face to a more recent face to her name and to her story.
I did post a picture of my mother with Dorothy, but it wasn't. Well, it was, I think, from around 1979. I don't recall. Anyway, I want to thank David Finger and Sue Finger and our good friend Diane Isaacs for joining us and helping us to honor Dorothy tonight. And don't forget, 2 weeks from today, Peter Wiesner, bipolar refugee. Thanks very much. Take care, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone,
David
for
and
coming.
David and Sue.
Thank you.